Self-respect is not something children are born knowing, and it is not something that can be taught through rules, lectures, or punishment, because self-respect is not an idea. It is a feeling that slowly grows inside a child when they experience being seen, heard, valued, and taken seriously. And yet in our modern world, especially for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, we often confuse confidence with self-respect, loudness with strength, and external validation with inner worth. And so many young people grow up knowing how to perform, how to please, how to impress, and how to survive socially, but not how to stand quietly inside themselves and feel, without needing approval, that I matter. Self-respect begins very early, not when a child learns manners, not when they learn discipline, but when their emotions are treated as real, because when a child says, I'm sad, and is told, don't be dramatic, something subtle happens. They don't just stop expressing sadness, they stop trusting their inner world. And when a child says, that hurt me, and is told, you're too sensitive, they don't become tougher. They become disconnected from their boundaries. And when this happens repeatedly, children learn an unconscious lesson, that their feelings are inconvenient, that love is conditional, and that staying connected requires shrinking themselves. And this is where self-respect quietly dies, not through trauma alone, but through small, everyday moments of dismissal that teach a child that their inner experience is less important than external harmony. And later in life, this same child becomes a teenager who cannot say no, an adult who tolerates disrespect, a worker who burns out, or a partner who stays too long in situations that slowly erase them, not because they lack intelligence, but because no one taught them that their inner voice matters as much as anyone else's. For Gen Z and Gen Alpha, this challenge is even more complicated, because they are growing up in a world that constantly watches them, measures them, compares them, and ranks them. A world where likes, views, comments, followers, and algorithms quietly become mirrors through which identity is formed. And when self-worth is built externally, self-respect becomes fragile, because anything that can be taken away by silence, rejection, or comparison cannot sustain a stable sense of self. You can see this in everyday life. A teenager deletes a post because it didn't get enough likes. A child feels anxious before speaking because they fear judgment. A young person stays in friendships where they feel unseen because being alone feels worse than being disrespected. And beneath all of this is not weakness, but a deep hunger for belonging without knowing how to belong to oneself first. Teaching self-respect does not mean making children tough or emotionally distant. It means teaching them that their boundaries are not rude, their needs are not selfish, and their voice is not dangerous. And this begins when adults model it, because children do not learn self-respect from what we say. They learn it from how we treat ourselves and others in front of them. When a child sees a parent tolerate disrespect, overwork themselves constantly, apologize for existing, or sacrifice their well-being to keep peace, the child absorbs the message that love requires self-abandonment, and later they will repeat this pattern without realizing where it came from, believing that exhaustion is maturity and silence is kindness. Self-respect is taught when a child sees an adult say calmly, "That doesn't feel right for me," without anger or guilt, when they witness boundaries expressed with steadiness rather than fear, when they observe someone choosing rest without shame, honesty without cruelty, and dignity without superiority. In simple daily moments, self-respect is taught when a child is allowed to say no to a hug, when their preferences are acknowledged even if not always granted, when mistakes are corrected without humiliation, and when discipline is rooted in guidance rather than power, because punishment teaches obedience, but respect teaches self-regulation. For Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are deeply sensitive, highly perceptive, and emotionally aware, harsh control often creates rebellion or shutdown, not because they lack discipline, but because they sense hypocrisy. They can feel when authority is rooted in fear rather than wisdom, and they resist not rules, but disrespect. Self-respect does not grow from fear of consequences. It grows from understanding impact, from knowing why something matters, from feeling included rather than dominated. And when children understand the why, they internalize values instead of merely complying with them. Another crucial part of self-respect is teaching children that discomfort is not danger and that failure is not identity, because many young people today crumble under mistakes, not because they are weak, but because they were praised only for outcomes, not effort, presence, or integrity. And when love is tied to achievement, self-respect becomes performance-based, disappearing the moment they fall short. A child with self-respect can fail and still feel whole. A child without it believes failure means unworthiness, and this belief quietly shapes anxiety, perfectionism, people-pleasing, and avoidance patterns later in life. Self-respect also means teaching children how to be alone without feeling abandoned, how to sit with themselves without distraction, because a person who cannot tolerate their own presence will accept almost anything from others just to avoid silence. And in a world full of constant stimulation, teaching stillness becomes an act of protection. This doesn't mean removing technology entirely, but teaching intentional use, helping children understand that their worth does not rise and fall with visibility, that being unseen does not mean being unimportant, and that silence is not rejection, but space. When children learn self-respect, they begin to understand that not everyone needs to like them, that disagreement does not equal danger, and that belonging does not require betrayal of self. And this understanding becomes the foundation of healthy relationships later in life. Friendships without dependency, love without fear, and work without self-erasure. Perhaps the most important lesson of self-respect is this: teaching children that they are allowed to change, because identity is not a contract signed in childhood, and many young people feel trapped by who they once were, by labels, expectations, or past versions of themselves, and self-respect means granting oneself permission to evolve without apology. For Gen Z and Gen Alpha, living in a rapidly changing world filled with uncertainty, this inner flexibility combined with inner dignity may be the most important skill of all. The ability to adapt without losing oneself, to grow without self-betrayal, and to remain grounded while the world keeps shifting. Self-respect is not arrogance, not entitlement, not superiority. It is quiet, stable, and gentle. And it shows itself not in how loudly someone demands value, but in how calmly they walk away from what diminishes it. And when children learn this early, they do not need to prove themselves constantly because they already feel anchored inside. And maybe the greatest gift we can give the next generation is not protection from pain, but trust in their inner compass. The message that they are capable of knowing themselves, listening to themselves, and honoring themselves. Because a child who respects themselves will still stumble, still struggle, still suffer at times. But they will not abandon themselves in the process, and that is what makes all the difference. Thank you, and please subscribe for more.